God gave rock and roll to you, put it in the soul of everyone. Let's talk about the past, present, and future of contemporary Christian music with Dr. Leah Payne on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
This is Steve Brown, etc., and I am Matthew Porter, your humble guest host, and I no longer want to rock and roll all night and party every day. I want to rock and roll till maybe 8:30.
But can we party every day?
Party every day? I do want to party every day. If by party you mean play Wordle on my phone, I'm still down for that. So that was our producer, Jeremy Birdsall, joining us in the studio. So we're going to go around. Our other producer is Jinx in the little glass booth.
Figured Jeremy is more qualified to be in the room today.
No, man, this is great. We're going to have two. It's going to be Frampton Comes Alive, double live. It's going to be great. Jinx, I'll put you on the spot first. Since we usually do little intro jokes, and they're always unfailingly 100% hilarious.
I know, it's because the writer's awesome.
No misses. Jinx, we're talking about contemporary Christian music. Favorite Christian artist, Christian band, everybody else is going to put on the spot as well. So
Does Alice Cooper count?
Yes. Yes, he does.
I had a fallback in case, because I was a big Newsboys and Audio Adrenaline junkie back in the day.
All right. Yep, I love it. Producer Jeremy?
Ooh. I would have to say it's got to be Petra for me.
Yeah.
It's got to be Petra. That was my first concert I ever went to, and I loved those dudes.
The heaviest thing you ever lifted.
At the time. Yeah.
Nice. I love it. All right. And we have our president, Dr. George Bingham. He's the president of Key Life. Favorite Christian artist?
Oh, gosh. I'll have to go old school.
Yeah.
Johnny doesn't count.
Way old school would be somebody like John Michael Talbot, but
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Amy Grant, especially Christmas music.
Yeah. She kind of carved that niche out.
She does have that, yeah.
Yes. And the soft feminine side of our program is Kathy Wyatt. Kathy, who do you like? Who's your CCM go-to artist?
Love Michael Card.
Yeah.
But also, again, old gray hair. I go back to, Michael W. Smith. I must have a thing about Michaels.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
you can't, those are great. I'll introduce our guest and then I will ask.
Did
her.
you say who yours was?
Mine? Listen, if you're talking about Christian artists, I got to go U2 always. That's like my Beatles. That's for a lot of folks, that's just. But if we're talking strictly CCM, Amy Grant. You can't. She's got the most
unsee her.
Unforgettable voice, just so expressive, and it's just one of a kind. I'll always love her. Our guest is Dr. Leah Payne. She serves as an associate professor of American religious history at Portland Seminary. She is also a 2023-2024 public fellow at the Public Religion Research Institute. She holds a PhD from Vanderbilt University, and her research explores the intersection of religion, politics, and popular culture. Her writing and research have appeared in the Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, and Christianity Today. And Leah's latest book is called God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. Leah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my delight and honor. I'm happy to be here.
We have been talking for weeks about this book. We got put on our radar, and you're like, yes, this is so great because, Jesus and music, great, and you've got somebody with Jesus in a cookbook coming up. If you could book somebody who wrote a book about Jesus and napping,
we'd have everything covered, wouldn't we?
Hang up the headphones. That'll be it.
Yeah.
So
I forgot about Jesus in the cookbook. Yeah, you're setting us with Leah. You're setting us with a great road here. Well, first we'll talk about Jesus and music,
hosting
and
that one?
then we'll move on.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Oh gosh.
Oh man. So this will be a real fun. We're going to talk about history and pop culture, and we're going to nerd out, just a little nerd alert at some point. But what a terrific book. Can't wait to dive into it. So my first thing I thought going into this is like, I know contemporary Christian music. You know, it's if you were to say where's the roots, I'd say yeah, it goes back to the late '60s and early '70s with you know, the ex-hippies and everything. And you're a professor, and I think if I was in your God Gave Rock and Roll to You Contemporary Christian Music 101 class, and I gave that answer, at best, if you were being generous, I would get partial credit because it goes way further back than that. Paint the picture in a little bit for us.
Sure. Well, you know, I should say that I actually do have a favorite. I was prepared to have a favorite contemporary Christian music artist to share with you all. So
Yeah.
I thought I would share.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Second chapter of Acts. I kind of do different ones and different, but I was raised by two Bible college students who were a part of that kind of hippieized Christianity known as the Jesus movement. And so I was raised on the West Coast, and that is where most people put the start of contemporary Christian music. But one of the things that, if you look at the businesses that created the labels that sold contemporary Christian music, you see that they come from communities that are a little bit older. And so I trace it back to, you know, one of the founding of one of the biggest labels in contemporary Christian music was Benson Records.
Yeah.
And if you look at the beginnings of Benson Records, you see two people who in the early 20th century, actually the late 19th century, attended a tent revival meeting in Nashville, Tennessee, in an abandoned lot, and their lives completely changed. They joined this very kind of hellfire and brimstone holiness preacher, and they eventually went on to become founding families in the Church of the Nazarene, if you know what the Church of the Nazarene is. And so it was these communities in the South that were built in revival meetings. Most of the people who create contemporary Christian music, there are always exceptions, but most of them either come from Baptist, Pentecostal, or holiness churches, if you're familiar with those. And so it's that group of people that create the overwhelming majority of it. There's every now and then there's a Catholic or a Presbyterian, but it's mostly those people.
Bless our hearts.
They're
Sing occasionally, they never dance.
Yeah, that's right. No, yeah, you cannot do social dancing, you know, in the early 20th century. No social dancing. You can dance with the Spirit. But yeah, so it's those communities, and you see them over time. And to me, that's the only way to make sense of the fact that while Amy Grant is, you know, I think the undisputed queen of contemporary Christian music, but there are a lot of other musical acts that are kind of from those revival meeting communities. So Southern gospel music, for example, the Gaithers, even singers that come out of those networks like Sandy Patty, who's another just, you know, contemporary Christian music queen. That it's that group of people. And to me, that's the only way to say, like, okay, how could you go to a Christian bookstore and be able to buy something by Larry Norman, who's this kind of rough-edged former, you know, he's a hippie convert, and then also something from Bill and Gloria Gaither, you know, like those two things. It really only makes sense if you look at this group of people who over time, and they're really good at music, I have to say. So they keep making music together generation after generation after generation. So you would have gotten a lot of credit, but it would have started with the parents and grandparents of those people. Yeah.
Yeah, I you know, reading the history, I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then I happened on where it said Benson. I'm like, oh, wait, hold on. Is that Benson? Because I've heard of that before. It's so fascinating that it reaches all the way back 100+ years. So what followed? So honestly, part of the origins of what we understand as contemporary Christian music back in that time was in part to sell hymn books, right? To sell some merch.
Yeah. I thought that part was really fun and interesting, is that these are really, it's the early 20th century in the United States. And so There's this kind of emerging, the 20th century is known as the American century in some history circles. So the United States was really coming into its own as a country and growing businesses. And so a lot of people saw the act of doing business as a way of doing Christian worship. So they would create these, John and Eva Green Benson, they go to this revival meeting. They are completely overcome by their experiences there, and they respond by creating a business that publishes. At first, they had pamphlets and kind of news articles and stuff like that, as well as music. But pretty soon, music became the biggest selling thing, and they create these hymn books. And really, the idea was that if you had this amazing experience at a revival meeting, it's a lot like what happens if you go to a church and you hear a song that you really love, and then you go and you buy the music so that you can experience it whenever you want to. Or nowadays, people stream it. But it's basically the same idea. It's just 100 years earlier, people were experiencing that together.
That's amazing. Yeah, there's so many moments in this where something happens and you're like, wait, we have that today. Different era, different technology. But the conversation, the mechanics of the thing, exactly the same. That's why this book is so fascinating. If you love contemporary Christian music, you're going to want to hang out for this whole thing. There's so much more to the story, so many surprises and little insider stories that are absolutely fascinating. We're talking with Dr. Leah Payne. Her new book is called God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. You want to hang out, we're going to take a little break, but when we come back, we're going to dive right back into it. So don't you go anywhere. We are coming back. Thanks for joining us here on Steve Brown, Etc. And by the way, I think it goes without saying, Dr. Brown will return next week. Have no fear. We are hanging out with Dr. Leah Payne. Her new book is called God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. Friends.
Leah, you based a lot of your book, it seems like, on some of your academic work. Talk a little bit about your research and background and what brought you to that.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Well, I started out, I think my research for this project started out being a pastor's kid. I think I'd have to say, just being raised in, I was raised in a very charismatic church in Oregon on the West Coast. And I was raised with a lot of the music that, if you know anything about contemporary Christian music, I was raised with Jesus music. So music that came out of the hippie revivals on the West Coast. If you've seen, there's lots of kind of depictions of that, but I was raised in that world. And so I was raised loving Keith Green and Larry Norman and Second Chapter of Acts and Randy Stonehill and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on. But my dad wasn't actually a contemporary Christian music fan. He liked Jesus music, so we stayed in the 1970s in my household.
It was contemporary in the early 70s. It got progressively less so.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
I thought it
But,
started
you know,
in the 90s, so I'm staying right there.
Yeah. So, but I was raised in youth group. And so, of course, I knew what contemporary Christian music was. And most of the kids that I went to school with had gone to, some kind of Christian music festival or something like that. And then eventually I, grew up, went to college, went to graduate school, became a historian of American Christianity. And as I began to reflect on the big important things that have shaped Christianity in the United States, I kept coming back to contemporary Christian music. Right when I got out of college, I actually worked in the industry for a little while. And what I remember about contemporary Christian music is that, sometimes people talk about it like it's a fringe part of the evangelical Christian experience, but I really saw it in people's lives as being a really core part of who they were as Christians. That their theology was shaped by what they listened to. And so I started studying contemporary Christian music as the charts of contemporary Christian music. So that the charts kind of get started in the very end of the 1970s, early 1980s and I wanted to know, what are the ideas that people, through buying contemporary Christian music, recognize as these are really important ideas. These are very important artists that we want to imitate or to be like. And so I just studied the charts over time. And then I also listened to the top 40 of, actually, I listened intently to the top 25 of contemporary Christian music for as long as there have been charts. So that took a long time. And my family has listened to a lot of contemporary Christian music.
Whether they wanted to or not.
Exactly. My kids really liked POD.
Yes.
I have two kids, and we rock out to that. They really, once we got to POD, they were hooked. But anyhow, so listened to that, and then interviewed a ton of artists and industry folks, and it's been a really long project, and it's been full of just unexpected surprises and joys along the way as well.
It's so interesting that talking about contemporary Christian music, it feels like almost talking to a fish. Like, hey, there's this thing called water, and the fish is like, I don't.
Right.
What is water? But you take the step out, you take the step back, and don't take it as a given, and kind of analyze it and take this scholarly journalistic approach. It's absolutely fascinating. So I'm glad you did this.
Well, thank you.
Yes, Jeremy.
Hi there. I am very happy to be in the room as our beloved host told you. I typically am in the little glass booth where Jinx is, and I enjoy that role, but I am happy to be here because, well, I've lived a lot of this myself, and I know a lot of these people like you do, and it was cool, as I know there's a lot of people who've read this book and gone through and going, oh, I know who that is, and I remember this, and I know that. So that was a fun kind of trip for me to go back, but I played with Sandy Patty.
You did?
In 1992, I was 16 years old playing keyboards.
No.
And
I didn't know it went back that far.
So you are excellent. You're an excellent keyboardist.
He's
is what you're saying.
That's
superb.
Pretty okay.
very,
Superb.
very sweet of you to say. But yeah, she's a monster. She's so good. And I got to play again with her in 2015, and she's just as good. Oh my goodness. What a great performer. But
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I know a lot of the folks in Nashville, people who had, sang with Rebecca St. James and the For King and Country guys. I'm friends with all the guys in DC Talk. And it's a cool sub community. And like you said, they're all terrific. They're all, magnificent musicians. I see you mentioned, first of all, as a researcher, I love how you have that pretty robust index at the back. So you're like, I want to see if she mentions this person. And there it is, right?
Not every artist who is in the book is in the index.
I noticed that too.
Yeah.
You
have to look. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say that the way the Sandy Patty thing came about is I was playing with the Continental Singers, produced by Cam Floria. And so I looked in the index.
There it is.
I did, and I was like,
saw it.
There it was. I did that. And that's how I got to work with Sandy Patty a little bit. But yeah, it's a remarkable world, and you've done a ton of research. So thank you for that. And it was a trip to read through this. So.
Yeah.
Well, I love that.
For
Go
sure.
ahead. I'm sorry. Did I interrupt you?
No. I was just adding to him saying for sure. For somebody, when one of the few good things about getting really old when you read history is you find yourself saying, "Oh, I remember that. I remember that. I remember that. Oh, I remember that." When you're younger and you have to read history, it's like, I don't want to read that. It doesn't apply to me. But I'm going through this, and there was actually some stuff that was like before me, believe it or not. But mean, it was just remarkable to read through all of that and to trace it and to actually relive, as the whole thing happened. And I'd forgotten about Jeremy and Sandy Patty because, I mean, let's face it. I mean, she's like, you've not seen Jesus unless you've seen Jesus with Sandy Patty singing "I've Just Seen Jesus."
And Larnell Harris.
And Larnell Harris, yeah.
Man.
Periodically I find that on YouTube just to watch it one more time because I think it couldn't have been that good. But it was.
There's a meme that just started going around on Facebook, and it says, auto-tune was invented in 1996, and then there's a little clip of Sandy Patty in 1987, and you're like, yeah, she didn't need that.
I literally saw that clip yesterday, and I'm listening to the whole song, and then she's going through, and we're winding it up. I'm like, you kind of see her backing up, like, she's not going for that note. She's not going to go
yes,
for
she
it.
did.
And she unleashes that. Oh, my goodness. And
I love that church lady. Like she nailed it.
Yeah,
she nailed it.
She is special music. So anyhow,
That's right.
So much more to talk about. Listen, we are at the end of side A of our record here, but guess what? We're going to take a break, return, flip that record over for side B. The best is yet to come. We're talking with Dr. Leah Payne, and we will return right after this. Listening to Steve Brown, etc. We are hanging out with Leah Payne. Keep up with her at drleahpayne.com and on the Instagram and the platform formerly known as Twitter at Dr. Leah Payne. See, Prince was helping
That's
us
right.
understand ahead
How
of
long
time.
are we going to say formerly known as Twitter?
I don't know, because you still go to twitter.com if you're using the desktop, so I don't know. Who knows
It's
how
very
long this thing-
confusing.
It's crazy.
Until the next TikTok comes
That's
out,
right.
I guess.
Leah, and the history that you include is really interesting and going way back. So there are a lot of different threads and going way back to the early gospel and so on and so on. But in terms of the from the title standpoint, the rock and roll, is there? I kind of have an impression that there is a little bit of a pivot point with rock and roll and CC contemporary Christian music that's like non-believers who were rock and rollers becoming Christians, maybe in the Jesus movement, versus people who were, Christians all their lives and getting into that music. Is that an appropriate perspective, or I'm just way off there?
I love that question. Thank you so much. Rock
People
and
always
roll-
say that when you've asked it,
Sure,
why you're
I
the
really
president.
do love that question.
Yeah.
It leads into one of my favorite parts about the book. So thank you. Yeah. So one of the things that I write about is that in the early 20th century, you have all these revivalist communities. So people who like to practice revival meetings with altar calls and stirring music and all of that. And along the way, these communities are recognizing the power of music to shape believers, especially young people. And so they get involved in a lot of action. For example, in the early 20th century, teetotaling. So the idea and prohibiting the manufacturing and sale of alcohol. There's a bunch of temperance hymns that are kind of actually funny to listen to now about the evils of the devil's brew and stuff like that. So these communities were pretty effective at it because they managed to ban alcohol, which is incredible feat in terms of just like the course of human history. But anyway, so they had been really effective at that. But then one of their own church communities, Black and white Pentecostal communities and some holiness communities, created from their church music a new form of popular music called rock and roll. And it was a very weird puzzle for these church people to try and figure out, because on the one hand, They had used music really effectively to shape the lives of believers. But then on the other hand, they did not like this music. So there's, other historians who've done a lot more than I have about why rock was not well received in those communities. But from the 1950s on, there are lots of different efforts. Like in both Black and white Pentecostal communities, there was a lot of dismay because they were seeing the music, their church music, being used to talk about sex and drugs and rock and roll and all those kinds of things about rock music. And so for a while, communities said, okay, we're going to ban it. No one can listen to rock and roll. We're going to tell you why it's all bad for you. Well, if you know anything about teenagers, that's probably not an effective strategy. It wasn't, they just kept listening to rock and roll. So there were all these attempts. I write about a bunch of different kind of stops and starts where people are trying to figure out, how do we engage the young, keep them in church, and still continue to shape these young people, but without rock and roll. Well, it turned out it was just hard to do. They couldn't really figure out a way to do it. So Jesus People, this small group of young people, many of whom had no background in Christianity, they become Christians in these really charismatic revival meetings, and they start making music for themselves and for other young people. And I think that's the real start of contemporary Christian music as a business, in the sense, because they had figured out how to use rock and roll and to play music that was made for young people by young people. Because, if you know anything about rock and roll and just American teen culture, if it's music that your parents are making for you, it's not as successful as music that your fellow young people have made for one another. So Jesus People, those revival meetings, I think, were hugely important. And then it was something that people started doing all over the place. I mean, the West Coast, California, was one of the major hubs, but it really happened all over the place. So young musicians were starting to use rock and folk music and write about God and really just their experiences with God. And I think one of the things that made it powerful is that there's something really powerful about, for example, a young Marcia Stevens, 16 years old, singing For Those Tears I Died, which is a really beautiful song. And it's just this really intimate moment between her and God. And it took off. It took off from there.
Yeah, there's so many stories in there where you think of, oh yeah, contemporary Christian music, and it's it's the end to itself. And so many times, in periods, it was a means to an end. It was, there were people leveraging music toward a certain goal, and so many points in the story where you're like, oh, there's really well-meaning people who are making that's not going to work out, and you're like, oh no, that's I know where your heart is, but that's not going to pan out. When we get to the other side of the break, we'll get more into the backstory, inside stories of contemporary Christian music. There's some certain process of making the sausage kind of elements to it in the book that Leah doesn't shy away from. The name of the book is God Gave Rock and Roll to You. We are going to resume that conversation on the other side of the break. Spending an hour with us here on Steve Brown, Etc. In case you didn't know, Key Life has a new podcast. It's called Simply Sermons. You can find it on the Key Life app, on your favorite podcast platform, or at keylife.org/simply sermons. We are hanging out with Dr. Leah Payne and discussing her really awesome book called God Gave Rock and Roll to You.
So, Dr. Payne, You mentioned something.
Meter's running.
The meter's running. Wow.
Buttering her up.
Shut down. Wow, I love it.
I'm nervous if you start with Dr. Payne.
I know. So, yeah, exactly.
You take off the glasses.
Yeah, like,
see what you see.
Oh,
we're in for it.
Exactly. So I play the music, and I grew up in a household where I listened to a whole lot of CCM, and we got into the late '90s, and I was very into DC Talk and POD and Skillet and
Okay.
Switchfoot and Reliant K, and then I got into Tourniquet and For Today and all the really heavy metal bands that had pretty significant crossover success because they were actually good. And then the worship thing happened. And I
Right.
am also a worship leader and have spent many years in that world. And so it's not that I don't like the worship music, I really do. And there's been a lot of good music that's come out of that world too. But it really bothered me in my core that the CCM thing transitioned so quickly from what was this thing, this juggernaut of creativity, into this wholly other thing. Like the only thing we will push or promote is worship music, and CCM really died a funny kind of death. And I would love to get your thoughts and your take on that.
Oh God.
Ditto.
Thank you. There are so many contributing factors to that change that felt, I think, really abrupt. I would say, so I'll parse out two of them, and I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you about this. But one of the things, these are kind of the surprising ones to me. One is that the way that American Christians worship changed. And that change disrupted the contemporary Christian music development networks. So more and more Christians now worship fewer and fewer times per month in mega churches than they ever have before. And what that means is the small churches have gotten smaller, medium churches are almost non-existent now, and big churches have gotten bigger. So if you were an aspiring contemporary Christian music act, the traditional development path would be you start in maybe a small church, coffee shops, go to some colleges, you work you up, you go to a medium-sized church, and then you end up in a bigger church. And so it actually took a touring segment out of the market, which was really hard for new bands to come up. So like I asked someone, why hasn't there been another Audio Adrenaline? Why hasn't there been? And they're much fewer and further between because they don't have the networks of support, just financially, to be able to get up there. So what is the music of the megachurch? Well, it's this stadium rock worship stuff that has completely overtaken huge segments of contemporary Christian music. So like Christian radio now, it's dominated by that. Now there are other forms. I think some of it also has to do with just the demographics of like what's considered contemporary Christian music. As demographics have shifted, there are artists who are making very, very Christian music, but it's hip hop, it's rap, it's, stuff that was not appealing to the old school core of contemporary Christian music. That's changed. There are still very very evangelical Christian folks who are super into music that it wasn't sold in that market niche. And so I think that there's so many different things that go into it as well, like how streaming technology has changed a lot of things. And, there's all kinds of effects. But I think, I don't know, from my perspective, people are still making great art. But one of the biggest things that what you wouldn't necessarily think it, but when I say it, everybody's going to nod their head, is the death of the Christian bookstore. That was a huge cultural hub for artists and for people finding new artists. And so it's almost like it's an indirect cause. And so with the death of that, I mean, Christian bookstores used to be in pretty much every American, like urban or suburban area, there would be at least one. And that would be a really important place for people to gather, and concerts. And, usually I write about the Christian bookstore guys. They were usually guys, young men who would curate these cool, like probably how I would guess you found some music that way, and so those are things that really disrupted the path for artists who are not doing church-based music to thrive. But I think, I don't know, maybe I'm just a overly optimistic person. I think with every new tech change, there's new opportunity for people to find audiences. So, they're like Instagram, TikTok, there are people who have these huge audiences. They're not present on Christian radio, but they're getting to people. So I guess I'm sort of like, you never know when someone will pop up. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's good. Just curious. I mean, you did so much research. I'm wondering if any story or any particular facet of CCM surprised you, or what's your? I mean, you took a broad look at. I mean, you really took a wide range of look at this history. What's your takeaway from it? What impressed you the most in doing all of this work?
Wow, there's so many, but I think one thing that was surprising to me, because I grew up in a charismatic church, as I mentioned, where we were, like speaking in tongues, words of prophecy, people being slain in the spirit, stuff that if you were in a Southern Baptist church at the time, you would be horrified by the things. And we knew that. I understood that about the church that I grew up in. I think one of the surprising things to me was to see that if you look at the music, and I'm thinking particularly of the ascent of worship music, that is a Pentecostal and charismatic style of doing worship. And I think one of the more surprising things to me as just, someone who was raised in that movement was to see, if you look at the music, you see how that movement goes from kind of the fringe of Christian experience and practices to really the center, to where it's hard to go to a Southern Baptist church now that is not worshiping in a style that would have been associated with those wild charismatics, even maybe 20 years ago. Yeah. So I think that was surprising to me because when I was growing up in it, it was just like very weird. Nobody, I was kind of like a little embarrassed about it when I would bring friends to church. And now I realize most people are, especially mega churches, are worshiping in that style regularly. It's just kind of how things are done now. So I think that was surprising to me. And I think music has been a massive contributor to that. Because, Billy Graham understood this very well. If you get people singing an idea, it's in their souls. And I think that's what's happened.
Absolutely fascinating. And we've talked about this for an hour and have just scratched the surface of this story. You need to get this book. It's called God Gave Rock and Roll to You. Great title, by the way. Of all the songs that were originally written by Argent and then later covered by Kiss, and then still later by Petra. Sorry, Petra then
Petra
Kiss.
did it first, then Kiss did it. Yeah,
you nailed it. That was
and
was
then
a great
Bride
time.
and DOC.
Did they
Bride
as well?
And the DOC.
See,
Yep,
I mean,
yep.
you can't beat it. It was meant to be. Our guest has been Dr. Leah Payne. Her book is God Gave Rock and Roll to You: A History of Contemporary Christian Music. Fantastic history. This music, whether you realize it or not, whether you're a fan or not, has greatly influenced your life if you are a believer. We still have one more segment. Hope you'll hang out for that. Talk to you in a minute. Thanks for spending time with us here on Steve Brown, etc. By the way, if you haven't yet subscribed to the weekly Key Life email, it's called Key Life Connection. You're missing out. It's pretty good. And I don't just say that because I help, put it together every week. While you're thinking about it,
He's so humble.
I'm proud of my work. I'm proud of the work. Listen,
we're all proud of you.
Steve does the
If
work.
you don't love yourself, nobody can love you.
That's right.
Did
Steve
you-
does the work. I bring the stuff together, and you're like, "Isn't that great?" And you're like, "Yeah."
Did you not get your participation trophy yet? For this one? Just-
Listen, let me land this promo. While you're thinking about it, go to keylife.org/subscribe. Okay.
Good job.
What a fascinating conversation with Leah Payne about
Yeah.
contemporary Christian music. What'd you guys think?
Yeah, call her back. Let's do it again.
You know what I would have liked to have asked her about, which doesn't really go straight down the music thing, but one of the things that comes up as you get into toward the end of the book and you get into what's transpired in the last 10-15 years, you have all of these people that were part of the contemporary Christian music thing, and things began to change in their lives. You had the divorces, you had people who decided that they were gay, and people who left the industry and then came back, and you watched how people dealt with that, and then you watched how they tried to incorporate some of the ways that they were beginning to feel in their music. And as I was reading that, I thought, is there a point at which somebody enters the picture and says, there's a point at which we can't go any further?
Yeah.
Because it is a something that has become more prevalent than it was 15, 20 years ago. But anyway, I would have loved to have asked her about that, just out of curiosity.
A lot about purity culture, and I'm flashing back to the 90s, and I'm like, yeah, man, that was like at a fever pitch, and you're like, absolutely, but you have to bake into that the idea of grace, and that if you mess up, when you mess up, God is still there, and you are not just discarded. And there's so many stories of where people just got chucked, just got tossed aside. And you're like, ooh, man, that's rough. I mean, because we can't do that to folks. But it's funny, all the little foibles and stuff like that. You're like, shoot, that's just our family, isn't it? Just we are messed up, and if it not even related to music, you see this in
at least the rock and roll people admit it.
That's right.
Right.
True.
And make money at it.
That's right.
Matter of fact.
Confess your sins and make money.
That's it, man. Hey, get it together. I got bills to pay. Well, listen, guys, we're almost out of time. Who we got next week?
Next week, we have our friend Eric Schumacher. We first became familiar with him when he wrote a book with Elise Fitzpatrick
a
number of years ago. But he's got a new book out. It's called The Good Gift of Weakness, God's Strength Made Perfect in the Story of Redemption. So it's always a good time with Eric, guy who, speaking of grace, who really gets grace.
He gets it. Join us for that. Eric Schumacher, Macher. Tune in to find out how to pronounce it. Join us next time, and thanks for hanging out with us. And until then, be safe and stay dangerous.
Yeah. 5 out of 5.
Thank you, friends.